Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nadine and I work for Treeconomics, and we would like to give a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. This webinar is all about tree planting in hard landscapes, and we're going to be taking a detailed look at a recent case study in the London Borough of Barnet. So let me introduce my colleagues. We have John Rose, Senior Consultant at Treeconomics, and Andy Tipping, Trees and Woodlands Manager at the London Borough of Barnet, and Dana Karcher from the Davey Resource Group in the US. Dana is going to be helping us with the Q&A session at the end, so thank you for that, Dana. So let me just run through how the webinar will work. We will be starting with Andy, who will give some background on the Barnet Opportunity Mapping Project, and then we'll hand over to John and he will share further details about how digital mapping was used to identify potential locations for street trees within the London Borough of Barnet. Afterwards, we will open the floor to Dana to host some Q&A, where you can ask direct questions about anything you've heard today. So, I'm going to hand over to Andy from the London Borough of Barnet. Hope you enjoy the webinar.
We've got a sustainability strategy.
Sorry, can I just come in? I think that we had a bit of a technical issue there, and some of the attendees couldn't hear anything.
Okay.
I think, is it okay just to give a quick recap? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sure. Okay, where are we? This is, I presented to the Environment Committee at Barnet last year about tree planting and trees in general, because we were going to write a new tree policy, and also Barnet are producing a sustainability strategy. And one of the tasks that we got given was to have an eye tree assessment done. I'd read a number of them from around the country and certainly in London, and discussed with the other art managers what it meant for them. And universally, they told me that if they were going to get funding for tree planting, then having an eye tree assessment was a really useful thing to do. So fine, we then started working with John. And on the right-hand side, above the image of the shade trees in Melbourne, are some of the eye tree headlines from the tree stock in Barnet that we've got. Yeah, 53,000 tonnes of carbon stored, nearly 3,000 sequestration annually, 16 tonnes of air pollutants, and all the rest of it. So that's in a wider document. If you can go to the next slide, please. So we had already published a tree policy in 2017, and it was really successful. And to everyone in the room, I mean, that would be if you want to take one thing from this, is get a policy. It helps so much with my team. It empowered the tree officers. It gave us specific targets to aim for, and also it got us quite a lot of funding. And it also won the Mayor of London's award. So this is us on stage at the City Hall, receiving that award from Sir Harry Studhome and Dane Shelley Rodriguez in 2019, I think that was. What it does is we had targets to plant 4,500 trees over 5 years. We did actually plant 5,000 trees. Now these were all extra heavy standards. These weren't tiny forests or whip planting or woodland creation at all. These were street trees and park trees. And so we had planted 3,000 street trees, 900 in parks, and we filled the parks up, to be quite honest. Our colleagues in Green Spaces didn't want any more tree planting in parks. The guys on the mowers hated it because they couldn't mow how they used to. And anyway, parks are used for, for sport and recreation and what have you, not just to be turned into places where we plant lots of trees. The one thing that I think this really was quite important was that if you're planting the best part of 1,000 trees a year and you are watering, you're going to have to water 2,000 trees a week, which is a significant amount. We were putting on 50 litres per tree per week, which is 100,000 litres of water a week. So that was difficult. Over that period of time, the Urban Tree Challenge Fund and Local Authority Treescape Fund were developed, and we were successful in applying for those. And that was really useful because it subsidised the spend that we wanted we were going to have to do. But we spent about just over £500,000 on tree planting each year, but probably £200,000 of that was on water. We identified also on the economic side that we got new contracts starting next spring, and we identified, well, guesstimated really that we'd get a 30% increase in costs. That's based on the construction industry changes since 2016. Next slide, please. So what we discussed with the councillors was, we did a SWOT analysis and let them know what we did. We delivered on budget, which was great. We've managed to generate income. We implemented the policy. On the weaknesses, we understand just the amount of work that was required for planting, especially in new locations, and I'll go on to that a little bit more in a minute. The opportunities, there was a lot of community engagement, which was good. We did about 50% of all the trees that we planted in 2022 came from residents or from councillors. So there's an awful lot of interest from the community in planting trees, which we didn't really realise before. We've now actually got the Trees for Streets. We've got an agreement with them now, so we've now got a website where people can ask for tree planting. It's becoming more and more obvious and prevalent. Untapped internal and external funding, so we managed to get some internal funding, and then put the policies with other council departments. That's really important. Working with colleagues in highways, any of you on the call who are tree officers will know that unless you're fighting with your highways team, you're possibly not doing your job properly, or they're not. But with the policies, we asked them to input on the policy, and they did. And that was really good. We developed stronger relationships with them, professional and personal, and that really helped colleagues in planning and the growth team as well, doing town centre regenerations. And then we looked at the threats, and there was an inability to deliver these increased targets due to staffing, actually, and that's internally with tree officers to do the job, and also with contractors. There's a lack of skilled workforce out there. Increased cost of resources, i.e. water, and difficulty in finding locations to plant. This is an important one that we work with John and Treeconomics. Next slide, please. So what the councillors wanted and what I needed from them too as well, what we needed from them, was to understand how much all of this would cost. So again, we did an options appraisal and looked at the 4 different options that we had to do nothing, to not replant any of our trees, which is obviously never going to happen, to only replant felled trees. We do fell about 500 street trees a year in Barnet. Mortality rates, ill health condition, what have you. Quite an exercise, just as an aside, which is really quite good to know from when duty to consult comes in, because we fell less than 20 healthy trees a year, about 500. But within that, there's reputational risks. And then the third option was to plant 1,000 trees a year. So to replant the 500 that we have to remove each year, but then 500 new. Now, one of the elements of that was that it was unfunded. And the last one was to really go for it and replant felled trees plus an additional 1,000 a year. So going back to the watering element of it, then we would then be watering, I don't know, like 3,000 trees a week, and it just, that one and also the cost of it put that out. So option 3 was the one that we put forward to council. So we would require about £700,000 a year over the course of the term of the policy. And next slide, please. So what we did was we looked at the previous tree contracts only had urban heat island and air pollution as target areas. As you can see down the southwest of the borough, where it joins Camden and Brent along the Edgware Road. That's where most of our pollutions are and most of our heat is. But also that's the built-up area of Barnet. So when we looked at the IMD, that's where our biggest council estates are and what have you. So and also that's where there's a place called Silkstream, that runs through there. So put those four together, we could see that really we wanted to target down there, but we wanted this to be data driven. We managed to get these maps, put them together. So we were giving people lots of factual stuff about really where we ought to be spending. So and focusing our efforts on. So your next slide, please. Okay, so from that, what we did was John will show you about canopy cover. So canopy cover is really great metric to work with, but I thought it was a bit simplistic. And also, I'd read some of the other tree planting reports and talked to some of the other art managers. And really, what was happening was that the planting locations were pretty generic. So if you had a big cemetery or a woodland or a golf course, it was factored into the canopy of that particular area. So I asked if Blue Sky could, the data that was had, could actually just let me know the street tree canopy cover, because we control the streets, obviously, with local authority. We don't control people's back gardens, we don't control golf courses. So I wanted to know the street tree canopy cover, which we were able to do. So we used street tree canopy cover as the x-axis on this graph, and put those other four matrices as the y-axis, and then was able, from the 24 wards that are in Barnet, to identify where we ought to be focusing on. And they were the areas that perhaps were pretty obvious, the more urban areas, the areas to the south and west of the borough that we've got. Okay, I think that's me with the introduction. So in a way, I gave John this real big headache of getting a lot of data together, looking at a lot of maps, and coming back and asking me, letting me know where me and my team ought to focus on. I think it's worth noting before I move on, was the new plantings, the replacement plantings are quite easy. All our trees are on a database. If it's valid tree, it's marked as a vacant tree pit straight away. New planting is really difficult because of the amount of services and constraints that you've got there. Underground services, overground services, driveways. So each new tree pit would require a member of my team or a couple of members to go out with a Cat and Jenny scanner, look at the location and see whether or not it was a viable planting location. And what I didn't want them to do was to come around and tell me to get lost, because a lot of these potential locations were just simply not potentials whatsoever. So that was the headache that John got, and thankfully we've been working on that. Okay, I'll hand over to you, John.
All right. Thanks very much. I think you've got my screen there. Right, I'm flip over. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Okay, does that work? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail to pick up where sort of Andy left off and do some of the detailed work. The first thing we produced for Andy was a canopy cover map, this one, and which is a fairly standard sort of approach. You get the canopy cover divvied up by the wards, and as Andy said, he basically more or less went, that's great, John, doesn't really work for me. It doesn't represent the reality on the ground for hard landscapes. And if you look at that sort of large arrow in the middle there, if you stand where that arrow is and look north or south, the streets look the same, and that's the sort of detail. It is the ward boundary, and that's the M1 going across the top. And as Annie said, you've got things like the golf course on the top right there, which is affecting the number for the canopy cover for those houses on the left hand side of the M1, and it's obviously very inaccessible. And if I just go back up, it's got 29% canopy cover at the top there and 15% below. So at face value, you wouldn't plant in that top one. So we then reconfigured it to give street canopy cover, and the wards appear in a very different set of priorities. And Edgware and Edgware Bury, which are the two with the arrows on the left hand side, you can see they now become a far higher priority to work with. So then we, and the way we did this was we removed all the canopy cover that was over parks, woodlands, private gardens, and just looked at the roads and roadsides. So it gives us a very different perspective. And then we had to dive down in, and as Annie said, we stacked those sort of 4 maps together. We had a conversation about how we did that and the extent to which we gave a weighting to one over the other. And in that conversation, IMD and urban heat islands temperature were given the priority. So they have a slightly larger weighting. We then stack the whole lot together, and effectively every 20 by 20 meter tile within the borough is given an aggregated score between the lot, which allows us to create the map that's on the right. This would be a different set of priorities in a different part of the country. Part of the power of this is the simplicity it has. You can still see from this how we built it up in the first place, and that gets us to new perspectives to inform the decision making. So we can score that hotspots on the left, and as Annie said, the boroughs on the right, which allowed us to create this chart, which is the one that you've just seen. This is actually the extract that Andy used to publish, which is the one that's published in the Barnet Council tree policy. So he's borrowed my chart and I've borrowed his. So that's great. So that's the high level sort of bigger picture of how we prioritize resources, or how Andy was able to prioritize resources and have that conversation at council level. What we then needed to do is look at how you prioritize tree planting at street level, how does it actually work on the ground. And you had both where is it possible to plant trees, and out of all the possibilities to plant trees, where should we start? So the map that created this there on the right hand side, that allows us to make decisions down at a very detailed street level as well. So the big challenge for planting trees in hard landscapes, as we know, is a battle for space. So it's a competition for space, and they boil down to different demands for that. And we all have different goals. There are different goals, and they're all perfectly understandable. Whether it's available pavement area just to move, to walk upon. Its accessibility demands, and the guidelines are for 2 meter wide pavements if you're looking at new developments, narrowing to 1.5 meters where there's obstruction. You need space at surface level to put the tree, never mind about routing below, and then the street furniture and drop curbs, underground surfaces. We started with the first 3, and our principle was to plant as many trees as possible was where we came at this, and that drove our thinking in some of the ways we determined the more detailed parameters, as you'll see. So to get into it, we started a nice aerial shot courtesy of Google, and that is more or less the road across the top there is the A41. So that's the boundary between the 2 wards I was talking about before. We then obtained the base mappings. This is Ordnance Survey master maps. It's very detailed and allows us to do some quite granular analysis within reason. It doesn't do everything. The first thing we did was to map all the pavements, and that included all the associated verges, anything more or less in close proximity to the roadways. What it didn't do was give us quite who owns some of those bits of land. It's not always the council. The next challenge was to work out how much space we had, or divvy that space up. So we then subdivided that into different pavement widths. We picked 2 meters as the minimum point for being available to plant a tree in. So if it's below 2 meters, we would take it out of the available space. 2 to 3, we'd take a linear approach, and above 3 meters, we would think about sort of potential groups of trees. And given our earlier principle of we're going to plant as many trees as possible, we're sort of cramming them in. It obviously doesn't mean that when you come to it, you are actually going to do that, but it points you towards looking at those areas. The next thing, well, not quite in order, but the next thing that we ended up doing was visibility displays. So you need at junctions, you need visibility displays for drivers to be able to see as any of us driving a car as we approach a junction. It had the bonus of dealing with a significant amount of street furniture in the form of traffic light. Point to note, this wasn't part of the which within Barnet. So we only added this bit in later, following a second project that we ran up in Stockton-on-Tees, and a conversation retrofitted back in Barnet. This is quite a key element, so it's a big good learning. We then took the existing tree canopy, and we had two sources for that. One was the Blue Sky National Tree Map, and the other was the actual Barnet tree inventory. Obviously, don't want to plant where you already have trees. Do note the difference in the two data sets. All these ways in which we look at trees have their pros and cons. So we use both combined in this set. The inventory is especially important when it comes to recent planting of new trees. So they tend to be way too small to show up on satellite or aerial photography for canopy data sets, and also they're quite often more recent than the canopy data sets that you are able to access. So it's important to get that in to get up to date. So we're not really making advice to do things where it's already been done. We just cut that stuff out and leaving us a space. And then we overlaid a grid, and this grid is grid of hexagons assuming a 5-meter space between trees. And that figure again was chosen to help seek out maximum number of sites. You wouldn't necessarily plant 5 meters apart, some 10 meters apart, 12, 8. Different places have different approaches to this. But in terms of looking for maximum potential, that was the figure we chose. And then we simply, if you can see them, the dots on the screen are where the grid overlaps the space after we've cut out all the constraints. And that then leaves us with our tree dots, and we color those dots according to the hotspot matrix that we created right at the top. And that gives us our priority map at a very, very detailed level in terms of where we could plant trees and in what priority order we would give to those. So that's a starting point for then doing additional work in terms of ground checking, or probably checking online with sort of Google Streets first and then going out on the ground. The one layer we then added in was ownership. So that's in this case, that's the Transport for London layer, which was then excluded. So it's great. That's a nice piece of work. Andy can take that and go, and Andy's team can go out and then go forward with that. All very well, but a detailed look showed up a few issues. Most notably was drop curves and car access. So that we had to go back to drawing board for that one. And we went and took a slightly different approach. So we took satellite photography and were able to map all the cars and made an assumption that that car had a driveway access immediately in front of it as it crossed to the roadway. If you look at that map in detail, you see some of those cars didn't drive in quite straight into where they're parked, but it allows us to take enough space out of that road to get a more accurate figure for the number of trees that could fit into that road as a whole. And that changed some of the figures overall, and that then gets played into the whole map. We took all this information, and a few weeks ago we went out to, all right, how does it map on the ground? We produced a set of so we provided the GIS layers, and that's fine, but we also provided a very detailed PDFs which were able to be printed off and just walked around with. And then we had some experiences when we went out there and some new learnings. So one of which was underground electrical charge points, and there's a new policy in Barnet to roll this out, and that's adopted policy. The tree policy is adopted policy, and these are both competing for the same space, and they're both things that council has decided it wants to do. And obviously there's a better opportunity for communication and sort of coordination on those things, and at face value, whoever gets to that street first gets to do what they want is one way to interpret it. But equally, it's something else we realise we have to take into account. But because it's a new goal, the data is probably available and it can be mapped. The other one that came out was the ownership of land. So on the digital mapping, you can see there under that sort of shaded rectangle, there's quite a lot of trees sort of marked out, again, taking that sort of maximal approach. And in reality, you probably want to plant a handful of trees across that section, but you can't, because what comes out as a nice big chunk of open space on the digital mapping, in reality and on the ground isn't, because it's actually owned by the adjoining property, and so that needs to be discounted. So there are some elements in that that space. On the other hand, it did also open up, identify spaces that maybe weren't immediately thought of without going walking the streets and without having an exercise to point towards them. So in this case, nice wide footway. There's a block of flats close by, set back from the road. This is somewhere that can probably take some large trees. So it's a good open space, plenty of space to go. It's got doesn't have a large number of underground or evidence for underground services there. So again, we opened up lots of new opportunities in that space. So as a whole, I'd say we found several thousand opportunities for trees within the borough, and I think in the round, the goals or the intention was to do the following. So minimize investigation time per new tree pit and maximize the benefits per tree planted, and cut down the amount of resource required, and then also allow good communication to justify prioritization decisions and that conversation that has to happen both cabinet and at council. Right. Thank you. Okay.
Are we ready for questions already, or do we have more presentation?
I think we're ready for questions.
Awesome. Excuse me. Just go ahead, and if you have some questions, you can drop them in the questions section, and then I've got those in front of me. And just a couple quick things. If you didn't get in till late, like I said early on, you kind of just missed the introduction, so you're probably just fine. And then Andy repeated his beginning, so we're probably in a really good place. So I've got a couple, first off, fascinating stuff. Maps were beautiful. I really like how you go down to that, as we say in the States, that parcel level to determine what you're gonna do. It's really great, and I took the opportunity to look up the Barnet plan, and
We lost Dana.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Dana, if you can hear us, you're frozen, so that's okay. Hopefully you'll come back.
That's great stuff. So a couple questions. One of them is a touchy site. Did you hear that question?
No.
No. Can you write it into the chat?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Intermittently?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to turn off my camera. Maybe. Looks like I'm having Wi-Fi issues here too. Maybe it's all over the world. Okay. The question I asked was, is there a requirement for consultation with residents? And that's from Chris, and he's with Cheshire East Council.
I'll answer that. I mean, the short answer is no. We've been given the policy that was passed is an instruction to us to implement policy, and I think that's one of the things that I value about policy a lot is that it may be a document that we wrote, but at the end of the day, the council passed it, and so we're now instructed to implement policy. Now, planting 500 replacement trees a year is tough enough because you do get a change in the landscape a bit, but planting 500 new, at the end of the day, we've got, we're empowered under Section 96 of the Highways Act to plant trees in streets. And if we want to hit all these targets to increase canopy cover from central government, from Europe, from the GLA, and from our own council, is that if the opportunity to say no and object to something is something that will hold all of that up. And so I think at the end of the day, I mean, what we tend to do is we'll plant 1,000 trees a year anyway. We've been doing that for quite a long time, and you might get 10 objections a year, and you should deal with those on an individual basis. So I would say that no, you don't necessarily have to consult. It's up to your councillors, really, what they ask you to do. But that was brought up when we did the presentation, and it was like, no, this is the job you've got to do.
Well, along the same lines, there was another question about community engagement in the planning, and how important was that? And were there any additional challenges through that community engagement that you faced?
In the policy itself, you mean?
And yes, in the policy itself.
Well, the policy was an adaptation of a previous one where we did actually open up, we had some public meetings and stuff. We just adapted the previous policy for, and updated it for this year. So there wasn't a huge amount of public consultation or input. I don't think, I could be wrong there. We may well have had some, but nothing that overrode, what we were trying to achieve.
Great. And so along the same lines, there was some questions about the use of GIS and how do the costs, this one is really interesting to me, although there are some really great insights for GIS use here. How do the cost benefits for this approach work out compared with just driving or walking the streets systematically?
Do you want to do that one, John?
I only have half of the questions. I think that's actually going to be one for you, Andy.
Sure.
I can give you a principal answer, which is officer time is really there are a lot of demands upon it, tree officer time, and one of the most time-consuming things to do is to go out and walk the streets. And if you can say the time I spend walking the streets is going to be successful because I know I'm going to find a lot of spaces because I'm already targeted, then it will play out. The people time is probably the most difficult resource to replace. So I think it pays for itself very quickly in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, and that goes on from the question previously. It's so difficult to plant trees and streets, certainly where they've not been before. The amount of underground services is huge, and driveways, lamp columns, you name it. Going out, and the fortunate thing about having undertaken this process was that we could identify which wards we knew had low canopy cover and had all the high elements of the other four matrices there. Going and walking the streets trying to identify all those things would have taken, not years, but an awful long time. And then when you do identify them, like I say, then we've got to go back and get the Cat and Jenny scanner and do all that kind of work. So actually having a focus on which ward and then bringing that down meant that, a couple of members of my team could go out with their equipment and spend a day really focusing closely on, say, 6, 7, 8, 10 roads, find the voids in the pavement there that we could plant with. So yeah, using the GIS has been hugely helpful so far. It was really good that David we had it because it was the first time we'd all been together and looked at it on the ground.
Yeah, one of the simple ways we kind of Andy asked us to communicate the data was just, that's great, but can we actually boil it down to a list of streets and numbers of trees we think we could plant in each street? So it very quickly came up with a prioritization, very practical prioritization list of where to spend time. One of the learnings when we went out on the ground was I learned that when Andy and Grant, the tree officer that came out, one of his team that came out with us, they would look at the map and look at exactly where the little dot was that I'd we placed on the map. And I was like, well, that means you can plant a tree somewhere in this area. And they were looking, no, you put it right there outside this house, all right? I'm like, okay, if that's how this works, then we'll have to get a bit more accurate in terms of nudging these dots to things like boundary lines for property. So it does make a difference, and all those things help refine the process, which is now what we're looking at doing in the sort of next round. Refine the process so that the time gets reduced for the tree officer to do their bit, to make sure that they are happy with where their decision-making tools are.
Well, and along the same lines, here's another question. I think I know the answer to it, but did you consider using Google Street View for initial ground truthing of the GIS recommendations?
It's one of the recommendations we make coming off the back of the program. It's like, yes, we've given you part A, Google Street View is part B, and then you go out. So yeah, you can do an initial sweep in that way.
Yeah, and you have to go ahead, Andy, sorry.
Yeah, and that's what really informed the thing about driveways, was that there was one particular, I just took one road at random where John had identified, I think, up to 50 new trees to be planted. And I knew this road and was going, and we've been focusing on it anyway over a number of years to plant down there. And I was like, there's no way we can put 50 trees down there. And then went on Street View, and there was just driveway after driveway after driveway. It was almost impossible. And we planted some new trees there in the past 5 years. So we had focused on it. So I think Street View definitely helped, but it did say to me, you know, that these locations actually really need refining, because if we just go and walk all of this street and there's no chance of planting any trees because of the amount of vehicle access crossovers there, the Street View really helped with that. Yes.
Great. So in the actual planting part, we've got a couple of questions. So what was the average cost for tree installation in the hardscape areas? Do you guys know that?
Yeah, we looked to budget about £700 a tree, but that includes 2 years watering afterwards.
And is that like 2 years watering? Is that kind of the norm where you are?
Yeah, we have a structured watering program. Like I say, we water 16 times each year. Starting in April, it's actually moved forward. It was May at the beginning of the last. That's how quickly things are changing. But April now tends to be a really warm month, and also, you know, we're all learning a little bit more at the same time. And I've been talking to other tree officers who are big on planting, and they said April's a really important month to start watering. So we start watering in April, and then in May, June, July, and August we do a weekly watering on all of them. So a couple in April, 4 in there, and then round off a couple in September. Obviously, it depends on what happens with the weather, but it's all structured into the contracts.
Okay, great. And how were the tree species decided for the new plantings? And do you have a specific criteria for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, there's lots of different information out there. We're developing our own palette, if you like, about what does actually work in this part of North London. You know, you can look at lots of nursery catalogues, and they'll tell you that these trees are great, but after they've been in the ground for 10 years, they're not so great. And we've learned what actually works with our particular. I mean, we've got a lot of clay in Barnet, where we're planting in new areas as well. These are usually more built up areas, and there's not much space at all. So in our palette, you know, we've actually got what we call tiny species, you know, which are essentially shrubs that have been built up. We use the TDAG document a lot, and it's experience. You know, I've asked all of my team that when they're out there surveying mature trees of doing the streets, that they look at the trees that we planted in the last 10 years and report that back to inform the palette. You know, right tree, right place principle, if you like. But it's worth knowing what works and what doesn't.
That's great. And this one is what has been a success rate for these for tree establishment. And is there any vandalism in your tree plantings?
Very little vandalism, actually. And it's a shame you can't see me, because normally I've got a backdrop of 100 Met sequoias we planted on the Edgware Road just over 10 years ago. Most of them are massive now. but of the 100 that we planted, about 20 of them were vandalised by people with dogs in the first sort of year or two. Vandalism isn't much, and we reckon, I think, because of the watering structure that we have, and I'll really emphasise, you know, if you're going to plant a tree and not water it, don't plant it. We've got I think it's 97% success rate. Funny enough, trees and streets are easier to look after than trees and parks. Trees and parks tend to fail more. If there's a drought, then the soil really dries up, and if it's really wet, then it gets really waterlogged. Whereas under hard standing, they tend to be able to cope with it a little bit easier.
That's great. I'm going to go back up because there were some questions about just a clarification. Are all the tree numbers being talked about just street tree or council-owned trees or all council-owned trees in Barnet? So was the project just street trees, or did you include other areas?
No, it was just street trees because, like I said, we pretty much filled up our parks in the previous 5 years. We have started planting on our social housing estates, but that's something that we only started a couple of years ago, and we're doing that in a slightly different project. But no, this was just looking at streets.
Okay, great.
We took as part of the brief within that, we defined a street as the roadways and verges and any kind of pieces of soft landscape which were adjacent to the roadways. So anything that effectively you would consider to be part of the roadscape itself.
Okay, great. And I think this question is probably for you, John. Where do you get your urban heat island data from?
In the case of London, we're quite lucky because the GLA has already published heat data. For the outside of London, then we purchase it from a data provider. I think I think 40i was the name of the company we used for one set of data, but there are different providers. But London happens to publish that data, so that's what we use. So on the GLA data store.
That's great. That's great. I like this question a lot too. How is urban identity and distinctiveness factored into the decision to plant a tree?
Andy?
Andy?
I'm not going to understand it. Well, okay, you've got a hard landscape. You've got everything around it. Houses. We've got, like I say, clays. We've got subsidence risk. You've got the passing traffic. You've got CCTV. We've now got electric car charging things. There are so many constraints to planting a tree. Like I say, you know, if we were going to consult every single one after we've just gone through all the trouble of identifying a planting pit, then we might as well give up. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. Sorry, can you read it out again? Because it was quite an interesting question.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I love that question because, you know, I do planning over here in the States, and every plan, every community, no matter how many times I say it, is different. You cannot pick up one plan and move it to another community because there are distinctivenesses between, among, I should say, different places. And, you know, yesterday I live in Colorado, and yesterday I was up in the big city of Denver, and I live in a small city south, and you can't do, although we're all in the mountains, we're all at around 5,000 feet elevation, you can't do the same thing. You just can't. It's never going to be the same. So I like the fact that Chris asked this question, and I think that every city, every community is going to be different. So that would be, I guess, the answer I would put there. Anyway, we talked a little bit about community engagement, and we talked a little bit about the use of iTrees. So this question kind of goes hand in hand with this. I would like to learn if you do any carbon sequestration estimates for the street trees, and if so, what tools do you use? Thanks.
Who's that for?
That'd be you, John.
Yeah, I mean, the type of information that we provide to someone like Andy is based on, so the two reports we did, the one that was referenced in the conversation with the council, the cabinet presentation was the tree inventory report, and there we took Andy's inventory and then processed that using iTree. So we use iTree eco database and software system to do that, and then we will create a report and present that back. But that is very granular. That will go down to individual tree level, as long as those have been assessed on an individual basis, which when you come to the trees you need to manage for risk, they're part of a risk register and you're managing in that way. So the intensively managed trees, you have that information that can be used and translated into ecosystem services at a single street tree level. It's a bit more difficult for woodlands and anything that's managed at a larger level. You only really can put estimates in place. So reasonable?
I think that's good. One comment here, normally tree planting initiatives are driven by a complete ground-based inventory to determine what exists, its condition, and where planting can and should occur. Is your planting initiative based on an inventory? And this is a great question. However, I think that we're not doing planting projects based just on inventory these days, because the way GIS can work, including advanced GIS, including LiDAR and things like that, we're now able to go to the parcel level. A partial inventory can give us the opportunity to see what trees are functioning well. So like if you do an iTree, say the structure, function, and value of certain species, that can help you get to the species level. But what's your thoughts on that? Not doing a planting plan based strictly on an inventory. Either of you.
I'm not sure. I mean, we've got a full inventory of all of our street trees and have had for over 25 years. So I've only ever really worked with knowing what's out there. So I wouldn't know how to answer that.
Yeah, I was going to say, in this project, we literally excluded the current inventory as part of the scope. It was almost by design. We were looking for where you do not have trees today, where the current inventory is not doing anything, it doesn't exist. So where we're going to extend into.
Yeah, I think with the amount of work we're asking our urban forestry people to do throughout the world right now, we're looking at changing the way we do things. So, but there is a question here: was existing highway data available and used to determine footway parameters and constraints, or was this established through Blue Sky? If the data was available, which assets were considered? And were any omitted that would have been valuable? So that's kind of a three-part question.
It's not Blue Sky. We used Ordnance Survey Master Map, for which we get a public sector license via the council to be able to use that data on their behalf. And so every council in the country will have the ability to do that. That's enough detail for us to get into understanding pavement widths and things. The criteria for determining that can come from local policy, which will be an interpretation of national policy together with some historical local directive. In Barnet's case, we converted that to a 2 metre wide requirement. If it's below 2 meters, we won't put a tree. We won't even think about putting a tree in it. We actually additionally, and beyond that, we would. In the case of all those 2 meter sections, we could then identify them and where they were. So part of the next sort of round of this sort of going into the future is those are the places that present the need, almost not only the opportunity, but the need to look at extending into the roadway. So then you're looking at curb build outs and other solutions that require definitely highway to get involved and have a look at how you would almost redesigning the streetscape to take account of trees, because currently you can't plant. The other needs for that space are too big. You can't put a tree in the way. What was the last part of the question? Other data
Let me
set.
go back.
Yeah.
Were any, if data was available, which assets were considered, were any omitted that could have been valuable?
There were lots. Nothing was omitted for which I could lay my hands on the data. So forget it, we used it. But things that are like BT cabinets don't have data for BT cabinets, for example. I think we didn't have bus stops at the time. Those EV points that I pointed out on the ground truthing, that data set would be a new one that was created after the project, or maybe in parallel. And the big one that we don't have access to is underground utilities. That is sort of, maybe we're going to get something coming through on that. There is an initiative which several people will be aware of called the National Underground Asset Register, which effectively tries to act as an aggregation of all the data sets the various providers use, so everybody uses the same data, but it is only really available to local councils and utility companies, and there are security requirements, and it's unlikely that we would get direct access to that, but there may well be derived data sets that will become available in due course, which will allow us to increase the percentage chance of success when you go out and ground truth, if I put it that way.
Yeah, that's great. And this is interesting because this is really timely, since the for me, the United States Department of Agriculture just put out a new heat map and actually zone map for what we should be planting where in the States. So has climate change vulnerability by area been a consideration? For example, imagining what conditions might be like in 30 years and whether or not the right choice of species is being selected to mitigate the effects of extremes, heat, flooding, etc.
Take that, Andy, first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my team talk about this a lot, about climate change, species selection. There's more and more information coming out about it. I do also think that when you plant a street tree, especially in London, that you give it a life scale of about 40 years. It'd be good if it makes 40 years, really. So, considering, we're not going to plant lots of oaks and stuff everywhere. Consider these are usually small ornamental trees. Going back to that urban identification question that came up earlier, if Barnet's a suburban area, it's full of pink cherries. Really, that's what people like. And we still plant quite a lot of prunus. There is concerns that they won't last. So really, when I talk to my team about it, I'm saying, well, use the literature available. Think about it as much as we can, but expect our street trees not to last more than 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I think if I remember the question, that it's obviously got two halves to it. One is the right trees that are going to survive in their own right, because they are going to face difficulties, which is that side, and then planting trees to deal with sort of climate change for us as in climate change resilience. We're using trees as our tool, and to some degree that's what this whole exercise, what it's about. That's why the mapping and the prioritization was put in place, using urban heat island, using flooding, and understanding that making those part of the factors for weighting the hotspots in the first place, because that's the information we've currently got. As forecasts become more granular and we're going to be able to understand the impact in the future, we can use that sort of data. But for now, what will stand proxy is where it's hot today is likely to be hot tomorrow. So that's what we currently use.
And also, I think, like, to add to that lastly, really, is that where we found we had large spaces like grass verges, islands in the middle of roads and stuff like that, then we are planting big trees. Take the sky, right tree, right place kind of thing. So you start off with considering the largest tree that you possibly can plant, and then scale down. Because going back to those images, those matrices we've got, the one, and from my image right at the beginning, the one things we do know that trees are very, very effective at is cooling down and providing shade. So yeah, we take the sky, we'll put in as big a tree as we can, but then we're scaling down right to babies where we're in tiny little streets.
Well, it's the top of the hour. So for me, it's breakfast time. For you guys, I think you're heading towards the evening. So we didn't get to everybody's questions. Nadine said, please put them, you can email them to Treeconomics. And I think she put the email, yeah, info@treeconomics.co.uk, and they'll email you back. Thank you for coming. Anything else, Nadine?
Yeah, I just wanted to share a couple of events with everybody, if that's okay. So, John, would you just go to the next page, please? The one with the workshop on it.
The workshop?
This one, yeah, so it's slide 3, I think. That's it. So if you are working for a local authority, for example, you might be a tree officer, we're running a workshop next week in Exeter. We have a couple of spaces left, literally. It's completely free, and we'll take you through how to make strategic plans for your urban forests. They'll be looking at some examples from towns and cities across the UK. And according to the flyer, you will leave the day with a full outline plan and links to free resources. So if you're interested in coming to that one, please visit our website events page and register on there. That's treeconomics.co.uk. And then the next slide, John, is about the iTree conference. Sorry, yeah, so this is the iTree conference next year. You don't have to be an iTree practitioner to go. It's for anyone who's interested in getting data out of their urban forests and using it to make change on the ground. There will be speakers from around Europe and the UK talking about how they have done that. And the great thing about this one is that it's a 3-day event. So you'll get 3 days of trees for the price of 1. Day 3 being a walkabout in Dundee, a treescapes tour. Again, visit our website events page for information about that. And I have been sharing information about our upcoming webinars in the chat, so hopefully you've been able to see those as well. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dana, for hosting our Q&A. You've been great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Andy. And I'm sorry about the glitch with sound at the beginning. Hopefully everybody got to hear most of the content.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.